I think that you start with two core premises, and the first is that language is data. Most people don't think of it that way, but natural language, as we describe it, is the language of how humans communicate, how we transfer data to each other. And so if you think of language as just another form of data, then it opens up all of the range of possibilities around how do you take that data and extract insights that enable you to accelerate your business processes, to make faster, smarter, better decisions, to have a point of view around your competitive advantage. So that's the first one, right? Language is data, and the tools and technology that we bring to bear enables you to extract value from that. The other one I think is also fairly intuitive, and that is language is ubiquitous. And so with the explosion of technologies that have emerged over the last 20 years, we've had this interesting dynamic where it has created an exponential increase in the amount of language that is available to the enterprise. It surrounds the enterprise, it powers their processes, it permeates everything that they do. I mean, think about, the hundreds of millions of social media comments every day that could be about the products or services that you provide. Think about the email communication that occupies a tremendous amount of every day. Think about all of the activity that is spent trying to find the relevant information that's embedded in this data called language, right? And so with those two things, considering language as data and realizing how ubiquitous it is, you can begin to understand how tools and technology that enable you to extract value from that, to understand meaning and relationships for faster, smarter, and more consistent decisions can add real advantage to the enterprise. You're considering applying AI-enabled tools and technology to language, and where would it be most applicable? I would offer three indices for that, or three ways of thinking about it. One is where the complexity is relatively high. So we all talk about a world in which most of us are knowledge workers. And we're constantly faced with applying our experience and our insight and our expertise to try to extract meaning from data. In this case, the data of language. And the more complex the data of the language, the more relevant it is, because it's the higher likelihood that you're going to miss something important, right? I think another one is where accuracy is important, and then a third one is where volumes are large, right? So in all three of those, you combine them and you say, if we have a relatively high volume of relatively complex language data, and it's important to make the right kind of decision. An example would be, say, reviewing policies in insurance to determine what level of risk is associated with the potential policy that you're writing. Very large, very complex. There's a lot of them, and you have to be very accurate, right? In the least applicable, probably in our particular technology, it's where the language data is highly structured. And by that, it's where it's presented in a way that enables you to make relatively rapid decisions with the information that's provided, say, names, addresses, in forms. That's not going to be taking advantage of the richness and sophistication of the capability that we have. And there's some fairly straightforward ways of extracting that kind of information, right? So where volumes are high, complexity is high, and accuracy is important, that's really where AI adds meaningful value. Well, that's front and center, I think, for a lot of organizations, just not not only for natural language, but more broadly for AI. And I think the single biggest challenge right now is complexity. It is still a relatively immature approach to technology. Standards have not really emerged around how you do it. So you have an awful lot of companies that are trying to puzzle their way through how they adopt the tools and the technology to make AI work at scale. And relatively early in the technology adoption cycle, not surprisingly, the results thus far have been, fairly thin. So a reasonable amount of money invested by any number of companies, recognizing the potential of the complexity of the capability, and then they hit that complexity barrier. And part of what we're trying to bring to market is a really practical approach to AI, which says identify those processes where AI adds meaningful value, or identify those knowledge domains where understanding what is important, finding the signal through the noise will make a difference in the productivity and decision-making quality of your key people, right? Start there and then adopt a common sense approach that's not focused on the latest model that's come out where there's some breakthrough claims around capability, but instead around taking what we know works and putting it in an integrated approach that ensures all the stakeholders are at the table. The folks who are responsible for the data practice, the folks who are responsible for deploying IT, and then the folks who are going to use it, right? So again, that complexity barrier right now, I think, is where folks are struggling in the enterprise. And I think having a very common sense approach to where does AI add value, and then how can we deploy it in a repeatable and robust way across all of the three major stakeholders that you're going to find. Yeah, so that's a relevant question. In that a fair few technology companies are laying claim to some AI capability because there's a tremendous amount of hype around that. It's clearly an emerging sector. And what I would say is don't look for whether AI is real, but look for whether they are adding real value to the enterprise. So what is their track record of helping an enterprise drive revenue, lower cost, or reduce risk? If you start there and then you get into the how they do it, right? I think that the part I would push on is, are they doing anything different, right? So when we have the definition of AI, an awful lot of the approaches for AI are basically open source approaches that are available to pretty much anybody. So let's assume that a technology company is using that one of those broad approaches. So then the real question is, what competitive advantage do they have in the way in which they're deploying AI capabilities? And that one, it's a lot less obvious in many cases why one approach is better than another. It might be a focus on a vertical, it might be a focus on a use case, or as with us, a focus on the tools and workflows to design and deploy natural language understanding AI solutions, right? So I would kind of go through the, look for the value add, and then from there, try to determine, is there a competitive advantage in how they're deploying AI? For the last part, whether a company is using AI at all, I think that will come out relatively easily. I don't think that is something that requires a huge amount of discovery to find out if something is really pretty thin on its surface. There have been any number of cases, though, where companies have claimed AI, and then behind the scenes, they had the mechanical Turk, which was a whole lot of people essentially labeling documents or doing some other manually intensive processes. That one, I mean, clearly is not AI in any meaningful sense. And hopefully that would be something that with just a little bit of due diligence, an investor would be able to realize. Well, I think there's two levels to that. One is in terms of how it changes the day-to-day life of knowledge workers, right? And if you take a step back and kind of big picture, if you look over the last 20 years of of this kind of technology revolution that has emerged across the way we do work, um, the the approaches that AI are offering, I think, in many ways will simplify and make much more meaningful the work that people do. So less time spent trying to find relevant information and more time trying to bring their experience, expertise, and insights to bear to make the right kinds of decisions, right? Um, I think there's a second element as well where I think all of us will have to become more thoughtful around how we view the data that surrounds us and how we frame decisions in a repeatable way, or frame questions even more broadly in a way that data can help to answer. And that kind of decision framing, understanding the data that's available and how it can add insight is a skill that I think almost everybody is going to have to continue to develop over the course of the next years as AI tools become more available to them across any element of their work.